Why is Japan more respected by the world than China? I would investigate the central premise stated as fact by the question before discussing the answer itself. Is Japan more respected by the world than China? Our current global order is in a state of flux, with traditional alliances shifting and new relationships being forged between old foes and unlikely allies. You have Saudi and Gulf monarchs cozying up to Israel and Russia and Pakistan, old Afghan war combatants, conducting joint military exercises and strategic maneuvers. With the shifting sands of world alignments, come changing attitudes between people. Japan actually did have quite a good reputation in our part of the world previously. Pakistan was one of the first nations to recognize Japan, and I think the first to sign a trade agreement with Japan as well. Nearly 60,000 tons of rice was shipped on emergency basis to Japan to help deal with food shortages in Japan after the war, and President Ayoub's visit to Japan was a major event, with the emperor himself receiving our visiting dignitaries at the airport. From that high point, relations between the two countries have been in a bit of a decline due to a gradual drifting apart. Pakistan supported China's claim to Taiwan and grew closer to her, while Japan was on the other side. The 71 War, the nuclearization of South Asia and further deepening of ties between China and Pakistan drew the two countries apart even further. However, countries can grow closer and further apart without there being a significant impact on their image. Russia's image in Pakistan, for example, has never really shifted towards positive or negative drastically, despite fluctuating ties between both nations. The decline in Japan's image in Pakistan, at least, and by extrapolation, perhaps some other nations as well, is due to a few complicated reasons. 1. The Japanese throwing their weight behind a US-led alliance. From Pakistan's perspective at least, China's rise is seen as the ultimate anti-colonial narrative. In modern times, it's often forgotten that Pakistan too has a major bone to pick with the ex-colonial powers. This confusion is probably due to the military's constant alignments with the Western Bloc, even as major Pakistani civilian political figures preferred non-US alignments but were repressed by the military. During the Cold War, most anti-colonial movements fighting against imperialist control over their nation's resources were armed and backed by the USSR and China, which positioned them as the champions of anti-colonial narratives and fights against imperialism. Pakistan's modern-day opposition to Western policy-making is too often interpreted through the 9/11 war on terror lens as some kind of inherent Islamic opposition to the West, which is about as infactual and fraught with errors as the trash heap that was Clash of Civilizations. Anti-colonialism has major schools of thought in Pakistan too, and while Russia does not get as much of a credit compared to its USSR era, China and India have come into their own as nations that could be thought of as ex-colonies, now leading the way against the former colonial powers in restoring Asia to her rightful place as an economic and military hub, with Asians in control of their own destiny. Our constant conflicts with India and India's semi-alignment with the US has dulled the shine on their anti-colonial credentials, in our eyes at least. But China still gets the full status of anti-colonial power, with the CPC acting as a vanguard for other Asian nations as well. And we see China's rise as the world restoring itself full circle to its original form before the distortions of colonialism, with Asia being home to the bulk of humanity's wealth, population, art and culture. In this narrative, the US is seen as spearheading the old imperialist order, and US military might is seen as being used to destroy any potential challenges from ex-colonies against the hegemony of the West. The feeling and need for a power to challenge the US and end its relentless rampage against the ex-colonized intensified after the regime change wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya and now possibly Venezuela, which caused immense human suffering and hardened our beliefs that we needed Asia to band together to defend itself against the careless rampages of our old colonial masters, who desired nothing more than the resources and markets of our nations. So when Japan began remilitarizing and joining US efforts to contain China in Pakistan, this was seen as Japan throwing their lot in with the hegemons who had destroyed Iraq and countless other Middle Eastern countries, and Japan supporting the old imperialist powers in enslaving the resources and governments of Asia and ex-colonies for their own enrichment. Pakistanis, or at least, most civilian Pakistanis, would much rather prefer that Asian countries band together to throw off the yoke of Western military hegemony once and for all. But of course, the rivalries among Asian nations themselves make this a difficult task to achieve. In our minds, it's possible for countries like Russia, China, India, Japan and Pakistan to resolve their differences and ensure the old imperialist colonial powers never enslave us again. Which is why when we see Japan break ranks and join the US in the subjugation of powerful Asian countries rising to challenge it, it is, to put it delicately, quite disheartening.